Hello, this is a guy who likes fanfiction and is too lazy to read, so here is Apotheosis on in audio form. Check the description for the links to the author. Chapter 51, Kadash. Knock, knock. Dorian's voice echoed up the stairwell and I set aside my quill, all but finished with a letter to Briola. Antition, I called out, quickly signing my name and resigning anything else to a postscript. In a moment, his dark head appeared at the railing, and in a moment more he stood at the top stair. In the fading sunlight streaming through the dalish-stained glass, the bare skin at his shoulder darkened to bronze, and the ivory leather of his jacket flashed with sapphire, gold shot through his hair. Of course he intended to stand exactly where the light would strike him, so there could be no doubt as he lingered on the spot to announce, "I come bearing gifts." In one hand he held a crystal decanter by the neck, 2 fingers hooked into silver-rimmed tumblers that scattered rainbows on the floor. In the other, a plate of cheese and charcuterie with a pear balanced in the middle, and a leather-bound folio tucked under one arm. "So you do," I observed, pushing back from the desk as he crossed the room. He set down the decanter and tumblers, then tossed the folio in my lap. The binding looked neither fresh nor worn, as if once made it sat untouched for years. The cover was embossed with the unmistakable heraldry of Nereus Urana. Oh! I traced the symbol with one finger, odd to be holding something of hers, willing myself to feel some trace of her magic but of course finding none. Salas said that I'd eclipsed her among the people, but I would never believe it true. She was favored by Ashabelinar, a friend to the Lady of the Forest, and beloved of the king. What's this? An answer to your question. The folio appeared to contain a series of dwarven letters and field reports, with more recent notes scribbled in the margins by her delicate hand. Some of the pages were clearly ancient and brittle with age, others newly added, tracings, musings, hastily sketched views of what could only be a tag. My eyes went wide. "You're quite serious?" It was just a lark, not even Salas thought the idea had any merit. "Well then, it's a good thing you've room in your heart for us both." He poured a generous splash of brandy into each glass and pushed one my way. "Antivan, sip sip." I raised it to cheer him and then gestured toward the couch. Dorian collapsed into an elegant heap at one end, arm propped up on the banister, and I sat cross-legged at the other after placing the plate between us. "Have a look," he said, breaking a slice of cheese for himself. I settled the folio into my lap, took a sip of brandy and stole the pear as I began reading in earnest. Commander Regner of House Kadash, the first page was a letter. "You were wise to send the relic you uncovered. The Shaperate has compared the carvings on it to various records, and believe them to be of elven origin, possibly thousands of years old." On and on it went, letters between the Shaper and Commander, excavation workers and assistants, careful copies of maps, rubbings of strange artifacts, and a fine script in bright blue ink, lights of Arlathan, Arian's blood, Ashabelinar. "Oh, gods! Dorian, you're magnificent." He pursed his lips in a knowing smile. "I can't take all the credit, of course. It was a very clever question. Where do the deep roads, Grey Wardens, and the relics of Arlathan converge? After much research, a trip to Denerim, and a few afternoons with King Alistair, I have your answer." "Well? Where?" He smoothed his mustache with his thumb and forefinger, a smile growing wide behind his hand. "In the ruin of Cadholish, rediscovered by the hero of Ferelden during the Fifth Blight." "I've never heard of it." "The Fifth Blight? Something of a ruckus back." "So help me, Shemlin, I will." "Cadholish," he continued unperturbed, "was destroyed in ancient times, but it once provided safe haven to the refugees of Arlathan. Actual Elvain. I could hardly breathe." "I'll leave you to debate such distinctions with Salas," he said, "but if you mean the elves who took their tea in Arlathan, then yes." Tragically, Kal-Sharik leveled the entire settlement to cement an early alliance with the Imperium. It was later built back up as Kadash Tag only to fall to Darkspawn. Nothing's left of Kadash today but a house of criminals and layabouts, as well as a ruin positively brimming with elven goodies. Oh my gods! That's it then. Where Corypheus found the orb. I believe so, yes. Did you know our sister Nightingale and Lady Morrigan have been to Kadash? With the hero of Ferelden no less. But according to these notes, he touched the marginalia, The Warden Commander returned there for personal reasons after the Blight. Personal reasons. Her notes are slapdash, but evidently to help the Dalish recover some stolen relic. My heart skipped a beat. What clan? He shook his head and took the folio from me, thumbing through the pages. Solon. I bit my lip, mind racing. I'll send a raven to Deshanna. Dorian waggled a finger. Stop chasing rabbits and focus, you're asking the wrong questions. I glared at him and shot the rest of the brandy. Poor choice of words, he scrunched his features in distaste. My sincere apologies. Inquisit a little harder, my love. There's one detail you're missing. All right. So Hawk and Varric kill Corypheus in the Vinmark Mountains, but somehow he possesses Larius. Eventually he finds Bianca, who gives him the key, access to a primeval tag, and red lyrium aplenty. And to think she only gave Varric a crossbow. Do go on. As a Grey Warden, the dwarves pay him no mind as he explores the deep roads. Years pass, who's to say how long, but eventually he stumbles upon the orb in the ruins of Kadash. Just like that? The power of a god left out like a plaything waiting to be found. Dorian cleared his throat. I should mention that the ruins were once guarded. King Alistair recalled that Nereus spoke of fighting ancient elven warriors throughout the ruins, sentinels that would neither speak nor listen. It was knowledge and loss in one fell swoop, twisting my stomach. By all accounts Serana had been a friend of the Dalish, formally securing lands for Keeper Linnea in the Brecelian forest. At the last Arlithvaean, Linnea told of how the Warden broke a centuries-old curse by befriending a spirit bonded to the Dread Wolf himself. I'd always thought it a testimony of her skill, but now it tasted dark, Elvaean woken from Othenera only to be killed by a flat-eared mage. Elgarnan, I whispered, so the orb had once been guarded. I should say something was being guarded. So then Corypheus has no trouble in retrieving the orb, but perhaps needed power to activate it. He's Tevinter, so that means blood magic and drama, I allowed for a wink, hence Justinia. But why the conclave? Why not do the ritual Valroio? You're so very close to asking the right question. Dorian took a sip of his brandy, his eyes quite literally sparkling. Where is Kadash? A flash of teeth and a grin before he downed his brandy, directly beneath Haven. Sweet Silas, I whispered. That's how an entire army of Red Templars appeared out of thin air that night in Haven. Dorian, this is everything. We do make a marvelous team, he said, peeling up a slice of saucisson and dragging it through a bit of grainy mustard. Congratulations are in order, I believe. If Corypheus is still using this as a base of operation, we may finally go on the offensive. I'll have Leliana send scouts to the Tag at once. Dorian went to fetch the sip-sip, and I snatched up the pile of presunto. He sighed in exasperation when he saw me. You're supposed to, just one slice at a, oh, never mind. I'm too tired to be human, I said around a mouthful, holding up my glass for a top-off. After he sat down, decanter on the little table beside us, I propped my feet on his leg and returned to the pair, oddly grateful he'd left it whole. Did you want Salas to take a look at this, or shall I pass it on to Morrigan? She was a friend of the Warden, after all. Morrigan, I pushed the folio his way. Salas is absolutely obsessed with the Grey Wardens right now. Can you not divert him? You're joking. Salas? No, he's right. Determining how Corypheus can possess the Wardens is crucial, whereas this business with Kadash will be more of gamble. Corypheus may well have moved on by now. Don't underestimate your intuition, they put you in charge for a reason. The sun had fully set, and Dorian stretched out his hand to bring the candles and hearth to life. For a single moment, I saw him in Redcliffe again, one hand hovering above the amulet suspended by his magic. He was the first human I'd ever trusted, ever loved. Of course he'd listened to me, of course he'd done the research, of course he'd remember that I hated sliced fruit. Thank you, Lethalin. For charming the King of Ferelden out of his lover's personal research. My pleasure entirely, you should see that man blush. Not really my thing, I pushed him with my big toe. It's just, I appreciate that you took time away from your own research to look into this. It means a lot to me. Well, don't let word get round, but you mean a lot to me. Besides, he said, slapping my leg, you'd be a rather shabby inquisitor if you only asked the obvious questions. We both glanced up at the sound of the door opening at the foot of the stairwell, and I tipped up my glass to finish the brandy. Josephine really would be disappointed with my inability to save her. "Quickly, wench, put on your clothes," Dorian said loudly. I snorted, biting into the soft pear and sucking just enough to make an obscene sound. The brandy put Dorian on the verge of giggles, but he held back as Salas came into view. "Ah, Salas, there you are. And here I only brought 2 tumblers." Salas stepped quietly onto the crimson rug in his bare feet and slipped the glass from my hand. "A third would be superfluous," he said, filling it for himself. Dorian huffed as he stood. "Well, I can see I've overstayed my welcome. But congratulations again, little dove." He took the folio but magnanimously left the decanter, and I watched him descend the stairs with a purposeful swagger that all but confirmed he was on his way to the tavern. Whoever would have thought, a cunnery and a Tevinter. I stretched out on the newly empty couch as Salas sipped his brandy in that careful way Josephine had shown me. "Apostate hobo my ass. Congratulations." I grinned up at him. I figured out where the orb came from. "Did you?" he asked, taking my pear for himself as well. "In an abandoned Tag under Haven." Salas cocked his head to the side and looked at me in surprise. "Truly? I'm convinced of it." He bit into the pear, lost in thought for a moment, then palmed the juice from his chin. "That is a remarkable discovery, Vihanen," he said, his pale eyes almost too intense. "You are dangerously clever. Corypheus is right to consider you a rival." I scrambled into his lap, unreasonably pleased with the compliment. I'd save the bit about the dead Elvain for another occasion. I wanted nothing to spoil the sweetness of his pear-stained kisses. Chapter 52, and Vino Veritas. We talked and shared the Antivan brandy as we'd once done with a flask in the woods, sipping from the tumbler by firelight until it burned down to embers and the room grew dark but for the candles. I'd long since abandoned the couch to sprawl on the rug at the hearth, far more comfortable away from the back-bending softness of Shemlin furniture. Salas had stretched out beside me, tracing the Valislin up and down my throat with singular interest. His fingertips felt unusually warm, the winter stillness that cooled his skin burned away by the sip-sip. We often drank together, and though he was perfectly familiar with my tipsy affection I wasn't sure I'd ever seen him truly drunk. Not that it showed, really. Instead, I found myself confessing something I'd left from my reports to the War Council. Something that only Dorian knew. What was that Tavanese saying he'd taught me, and Vino Veritas? I'd been staring up at the stone owls and reminded of Phalandin, which sent me wondering if he'd come for Salas when he died or if that other Salas was in some sort of limbo. How did time magic work on those who've been guided already into the beyond? Tears trickled sideways and down to my ears, but it wasn't a real cry. Not the choking kind. Yet of course Salas noticed and I had to explain. "I tried to save you," I said. "What?" "In Redcliffe." "Vihanen," he whispered. "You must not torture yourself with that abomination." A laugh died on my lips. That's exactly what the other Salas called it. Salas looked torn between a wry smile and a frown, which was to say, identical to the Salas who said I am dying but no matter. Dorian said he'd need an hour to work the spell, but Leliana gave us seconds. It was insane. Who could do an hour of magic in a heartbeat? I didn't know Dorian then, his little trick for snapping the veil to focus, but I knew you. I knew that if we could stay together, we could escape, and if we could escape you would have a better plan because you'd already spent a year thinking about it. So, before Dorian enchanted the amulet, I asked you if there was another way. His fingers went still. Your eyes were red and glowing and fierce, then you started to tell me something, but Leliana cut you off. And in the next moment, demons came pouring through, and you were all dead, and it was just me and this Shem mage I didn't know and the spell wasn't done and... Stop. Rial, stop. Look at me, listen to the sound of my voice and breathe. Can you feel my warmth on your skin? I am alive. I am here. That world does not exist. It did. It was real. For a time, he said sternly. But you fought your way back so that none of it would come to pass. It never happened. He held my gaze, his eyes like ice and so unlike the blazing red of that dying man in Red Cliff. Yet that Salas had known me too, his words sharpening my fear of Corypheus and giving weight to the Inquisition, his sacrifice immeasurably deepening the trust I'd later place in my flat-eared Haran. All of it happened. I surged up, unable to remain on my back with the memory of a demon dragging his corpse. Salas, it was real, you were real, and you died for me. In an instant, he was astride me, his mana spilling into me and hands pushing down. That world is already gone, and you must let it go. The overwhelming fullness of his magic left me gasping, and I shuddered when he snapped it against me again. He didn't stop even as he wrestled me out of my clothes, and I rebelled by kicking and twisting and pushing and wrenching away if only because I knew how it provoked him. But Salas knew it was a shame even before his fingers found the wetness between my thighs. His kisses burned with brandy, and I grabbed for him in 1,000 places, running my fingers along his jaw, up to the points of his ears and back down to his neck, scrabbling across his shoulders, tugging off the fleece of his shirt, trying to undo the lacing that kept him from me. Salas shifted to his knees, candlelight flickering over the flat plane of his stomach, trousers parting to reveal the smooth skin below. I rose up to curl my tongue around the base of him and his fingernails scraped behind my ears. I dragged his breeches lower with one hand, pulled him into my mouth with the other, the musk of him anchoring me in the now. He pressed me back into the rug, kneeling over me with one hand on the back of my neck to cradle my head between his legs. The other hand found my breast, kneading in a way that felt as if he were drawing my mana through the skin only to feed it back to me, letting me suck it from him in one delirious loop that left me wanton and lost. I could come like that, did come like that, for as long as he would let me. Then I tipped my head back so he could rock deeper, slide himself down my throat until the rest of him pressed against my chin. It had been a trick practiced over long winters piled up with my lethalin in an arrival, but with Salas it was always a struggle. My hands were on his calves, clenching and unclenching as I fought for air, heart racing at the denial until I couldn't help but thrash. Look at me. Somehow I managed to, and the ferocity in his eyes only licked at the throbbing want between my legs. His thumb traced my lips around his cock, and my heart beat faster knowing exactly how I must look to him, cheeks hollow, mouth wide. I am not a jealous man, Rial, but I will not share you with a shadow. He slid out until the tip of his cock rolled across my lower lip, leaving me to gasp and pant around it. Somehow he'd grounded me, smothered the memory of Red Cliff until I lived and breathed for one Salas alone. After I'd caught my breath, he turned me on my stomach to ease between my legs. We groaned together in satisfaction, as if we had been denied for eons rather than the hours since morning. Every time he slipped inside, my whole world was illuminated. The fade felt closer, dancing, bright, and every touch an ecstasy. I wondered how Dorian could suffer to be with anyone but a mage, how I'd ever taken pleasure apart from magic. The searing heat of his tongue traced over my tragus where earlier my tears had rolled past, then he planted a gentle kiss. Sleep, he whispered. Come to me in the fade. I spasmed around him at the notion. How can I possibly? Focus, he rumbled. That indomitable focus. I squirmed. There was absolutely nothing to focus on but the fact that I was speared beneath him. I lifted my hips to grind up against his cock, whimpering despite myself at the sensation and then rocking harder to elicit some sort of response. But Salas only settled himself down, drawing his forearms around me and resting his chin on my shoulder. Or fuck yourself senseless, if that's what you prefer. I am in no hurry. He flexed inside me and I bit back a moan. He could be so outrageously smug about his stamina it was no wonder he'd laughed like Fenharel when I once called it into question. Surely he wouldn't drift away to leave me pinned like that, too wildly aroused to ever find my way into the fade, stuck for hours. My pulse quickened. He would. He absolutely would. A wicked idea came to mind, and I began pulsing my mana in rhythm with my hips, building waves of magic that sloshed between us as I stroked him within me. Salas made dismissive sound as if he were not impressed, the liar, and I smirked to think he hadn't seen the half of it. When our magics felt chaotic and full, and when the tension of his cock running through me felt like more than I could bear, I cast the anchor. For one instant I was aware of nothing but clawing, digging, searing pain as his fingernails raked across the backs of my arms, and in the next nothing but a howling roar of pleasure so feral I didn't even recognize solace in the sound. I lost all thought in the force of an orgasm fierce enough that it felt like I was tumbling down a mountain, and maybe I was, because when I opened my eyes I found myself standing knee-deep in the snow, blinking and blinded by daylight. Or, greenish daylight. It was the fade, to be sure, but also the frost backs. Curious wisps began to gather where I stood naked though not cold, terribly confused, and perfectly alone. A heartbeat later, hot hands were on me, and Solace was spinning me into his arms with breathless kisses. I tumbled back into a surreal snowdrift, as fluffy and unmelting as a featherbed. "You wicked thing," he panted, landing atop me. In a dreamy blur of motion, he'd sheathed himself once more to light a scorching pleasure along every nerve. He drew back almost in full, then plunged in again with enough force that I was driven into the whiteness all around. It crunched and compacted as snow should, but felt like lyrium tasted, warm and bright and buzzing with magic. Wisps darted around us, touching down to kiss our skin and dart through our pleasure, harmless and beautiful like fireflies. I wrapped my legs around his waist, hooking my ankles at his ass to drive him in deeper. Solace arched to suck one nipple into his mouth, tongue swirling it taut. Then it was forgotten and replaced by an overwhelming pressure inside me, a growing tightness that sent me shivering and trembling. I verged on panic for an instant. "Solace, something's W." I cried out incoherently, awash in what could only be the sweetest, sharpest pleasure he'd ever given me. It felt like I was being fucked from the inside out, the sensations all jumbled and rushing, clenching, and shuddering until my legs fell slack. I curled into him so hard I would have pushed him off had he not looped one arm around my waist anchor himself. With this, his rhythm grew more frantic, his groans more desperate and pleading, until he clenched his teeth and barreled into a climax of his own. The wildness of it caught me in its wake, guiding me through a pleasure as bright and shining as the snow. We floated, adrift in the silence of the fade. "Finethus Lhasa," he breathed. "Oh my God, Solace." "Arin ma, Vihanan," he said, voice ringing with a fullness from both worlds that left me gasping. It was no wonder he called himself Pride, he'd just fucked me on either side of the veil. Chapter 53, The Arbor Wilds. There were moments that it felt like the emerald graves, thick underbrush and ancient ruins, sunlight through trees and babbling water always just out of sight, but the taste of the Arbor Wilds was unique unto itself. The land was telenast to the Dalish, forbidden for reasons long forgotten. I could feel the explanation in the damp earth between my toes, ancient magic permeating the very ground beneath us, waiting for a voice to give it life. I ran for a while alongside Gaspard, letting him tear a path through the Red Templars while I kept a barrier tight around us and called up rifts where I could. He was as clever a partner on the battlefield as he'd been in the Winter Palace, and to fight alongside him came as an unexpected pleasure. All the more so for the brief time Bryla fought with us. The two fought with a coordinated effort that suggested mutual respect, and I hoped I could count it a sign that their alliance would hold. I'd lost sight of Solace in the midst of it all, but remained aware of him in the whisper of frost that slowed my enemies. Explosive sounds like magic or Gotloke thundered through the trees, along with war cries and the clash of steel, but it all seemed muffled and distant. In time, we reached a place where the path narrowed, and Gaspard had flashed a wan smile beneath the mask of his helm as he hunkered down to hold the point. Now I was not tasked to fight, but to run if I could not reach the Temple of Mythal before Corypheus, all would lost. I found myself perfectly alone and content to be sprinting through the woods, skirmishing with a few rogue archers and Templar horrors, but nothing serious enough to slow my pace. Eventually, I skittered down the side of a rocky embankment and waded into a wide stream, pebbles beneath my feet smooth as glass from untold centuries of polishing. I felt an odd ripple in the veil, as fine as Orlchion silk, like some gossamer thing that could be crumpled small within my fist. Instinctively, I reached out for it with my own magic, then pushed to slip like a needle through the folds. I exploded out on the other side, splashing beneath a ruined bridge that I'd spotted in the distance. A moment later, Solace came crashing through to join me, eyes wide. "How did you?" His question was cut short by a flurry of arrows that sent us dodging back for cover. I bounced up a barrier, and whispered for Amalia while he brought up an ice wall to bottleneck the archway where we'd found ourselves. He stood close enough that his ice armor had begun creeping over my breastplate unbidden. I panted for breath, wide-eyed at the discovery myself. I just did. Stepping through the Fade takes a unique combination of spatial awareness and intuition of the variations within the veil. That was remarkable. I smirked at the compliment buried in technicalities, and tugged him to the shore. When our feet were safely clear of the water and wet earth, I sent a current of lightning racing downstream to clear out the unsuspecting archers. Salas, meanwhile, laid ice mines to cover our backs. Should we wait for Cassandra? We are here. Cassandra and Morrigan broke through the thick underbrush behind us, startling a flock of jewel-colored birds into flight. Ahead, a few Inquisition soldiers shored up our offensive line, and Cassandra adjusted her shield to charge through to the rocky alluvium to join them. Beside me, the hulking corpse of a Templar shambled to its feet in Amalia's thrall, and Morrigan dissolved into a stinging swarm that dove into the fray. I glimpsed sunlight bounding off daggers that could only have belonged to Cole. That was all of us, then. Everyone else had remained to defend Skyhold, or to fortify the base camp with Briola and Gaspard. I threw a static cage around a group of Templars trying to flank us, letting a stray thread of the spell's mana catch against Salas' aura. He immediately changed the rhythm of his casting, sweeping his staff in an elegant arc to alter gravity within its bounds. It crushed the Templars together, and I drew on his aura to bring ice into their midst just before Salas ripped a boulder up from the creek bed. Our magics dipped in perfect synchronization, then popped up together in a bubble of focus. For one perfect moment, I could see every individual piece of Templar armor shattering into the air, the spray of blood and broken bones, hilts torn from blades paused in their somersaults, and shards of ice suspended like soap suds. Time had gone perfectly still, and Salas caught me up in his arms for just an instant, our mouths and mana rushing together in the sweetest, saddest kiss, a stolen goodbye before our final onslaught against Corypheus. To anyone else, we'd have been no more than a blur, but for that heartbeat we were unrushed and unbound. We'd never done anything so reckless, but there was no guarantee that either of us would survive. And even if I did, I'd seen too many broken amulets of power and fractured Eluvians to pretend things ever ended well for enchanted vessels. That I was a living thing did not improve my odds. Salas had been able to stabilize the anchor before it killed me in Haven, but just barely. Could he save me again if Corypheus used the orb against me? I suspected that he shared my fear. Our fight in the snow after Halam Shirel had taught me exactly how Salas kissed his apologies. We soon parted and the effect was dispelled, the world suddenly too fast and too bright. In the fallout it was clear that the battle was done, and I shouted for a scout to bring Cullen. He would hold the point secure. When the order was given, I finally had the chance to look up at the temple gates, and I swore softly to myself. By the Dread Wolf. Two monumental statues of Fenharel flanked the entrance, heads thrown back in an eternal howl. The statues were every bit as old as the ruins all around, as ancient as Arlathan, and I wondered if their presence set the example that every Dalish clan followed. Not that I had time to give it thought. We took off toward a broad staircase to the left, in turn flanked by the twin hearts of Gillannain, the symbol of my own clan. It brought us to a terrace guarded by another pair of wolves, this time lying in repose. Creators, he was everywhere. I shuddered to think that the temple predated the Great Betrayal, dating to a time when Mythal walked the earth and had no cause to distrust Fenharel. All the stories and legends of my childhood, all the deeply held and half-formed beliefs, the truth of it all was here. Salas had gone terribly quiet. He'd told me of the towering spires and glittering halls of Arlathan, so I knew it was not his first time to explore such an ancient ruin, but to be here in the flesh with no time to explore could have only been agony for a man so singularly fixated on the Fade. Sweet Silas, the things that man could do in the Fade. Voice ringing with fullness from both worlds, guiding me to the shining places. He calls himself Pride. Cole's voice echoed through the stone corridor that led off to the inner sanctum, and I was deeply, impossibly grateful that his cryptic way with words had, for once, kept my distracted thoughts from being laid bare. Salas had long since dominated whatever focus I had, even in a place such as this my mind drifted to him. I nicked a few vials of lyrium from a broken supply crate, slipping one to Morrigan and Salas before downing one myself. "Are we ready?" "I hear fighting ahead," said Morrigan. We sprinted the length of the shadowed corridor, and to my great surprise it didn't open up to a room, but a world. Flocks of birds flying past, a tree the size of a mountain, a waterfall, a lake, an island, an entire paradise that had languished for millennia. I could speak of what the creators had wrought in the abstract, but this had truly been their handiwork. It left me breathless and in awe, but then my heart came to a dead stop. Corypheus. Along with him on the lower level, a handful of Templars, straggling grey wardens, and Samson facing down a dozen Dalish elves defending the narrow bridge. Corypheus stepped onto the bridge and two enchanted stone dragons sang to life, ancient runes glowing and focusing energy that tore through the Elder One as he struggled to pass. There was a blinding white light and energy and magic washing over us all. Then, as magical vessels are wont to do, the statues exploded to leave nothing in their wake but a ring of dead bodies 30 feet across. Salas whispered something I couldn't quite catch, though I was sure of the sentiment: fuck. Fearfully, we eased our way down the stairs. Surely, this could not be over. I scanned the broken bodies and gore for the orb, but saw nothing. Far across the bridge, Samson was urging his men through a monstrous doorway, and he paused long enough to taunt me with a grin. I was torn away from his gaze by the sick tremor of magic behind me. I spun to find a grey warden kneeling in the carnage, limbs twisting and coughing blood. It cannot be. I'd have to give Morrigan the edge when it came to intuiting blood magic, because my mind was unwilling to grasp what I saw until the man threw back its head to vomit a fountain of blood from which the form of Corypheus began shaking and tearing its way into the world. For a second we were all poised to fight him there, but the cry of an archdemon crashing down through the trees changed our minds. Cassandra grabbed me by the arm and shoved, sending me toward the bridge and over through the elven bodies that blocked our path. It was an all-out sprint, but our lighter frames and armor put me and Salas in the lead. We tore through the main doors and he shouted at me to begin the work of closing them, knowing from their size it would be no quick task. In a heartbeat Cassandra was at my side, throwing her weight into the door with mine, and I saw Cole and Morrigan join Salas. Finally we had the doors swinging on their hinges to slam shut, and we were all thrown flat on our backs by the force of the explosion on the other side. Chapter 54, Fenharil, the Dread Wolf. The ivy fell from the stone in fistfuls, bit by bit revealing the flowing script below. At first blush it was perfect gibberish, but then I caught a familiar radical and the context put the rest in perspective. The characters were merely stylized, illuminated by superfluous strokes like the first letter of an Antivan fairy tale. However much I missed when Salas spoke too fast, and however I flailed for words aloud, reading came easily. To gather lore is the work of a keeper, and there was no city in the free marches where I had not raided the bookshops for the language of my people. The more florid the prose, the patchier my vocabulary, but this poem was meant for the masses. Peace on the way of sorrow. Pause not for lingering doubt. Bare feet atone. Pure hearts alone. Whisper wisdom above a shout. Sweet sacrifice of duty. Bound in breaking to mythal. Untold years. To gather the tears of those drown in the well withal. Salas spoke up behind me, Oddish al vir abelasin, it means, enter the path of the well of sorrows. There is something about knowledge, added Morrigan. Respectful or pure, Shivan, 'tis all I can translate. I glanced between the two, uncertain of their ruse. I knew full well that Salas could read it, and found it implausible that Morrigan could make the Eluvian her life's work without picking up far more than that. If anything, Salas remained silent so Morrigan would reveal her hand, and in turn her trustworthiness, but I felt deeply uncomfortable with treating the Temple of Mythal like the game. All right, I said hesitantly. Is this the part where I pretend to be illiterate, or are we going to talk about this? Morrigan's look of astonishment and the way Salas shifted his eyes told me everything I needed to know. They hadn't actually considered that I could read. Ah, I see. I cleared my throat. So, obviously, I'm missing something. This seems fairly straightforward, yet you've both turned into dirthuman over it. If you have some particular insight, now would be the time. She's imagining how it would feel to strike you both with lightning, said Cole in wonder. When I turned sharply to glare, he shrugged in a way that only Varric could have taught him. You said if we had insight we. So I did. Ma Serenas, sweet Cole. T would seem I have underestimated you, Inquisitor. Yet in so doing, my purpose was not to obscure the truth. I have merely grown accustomed to the solitude of my musing. Supplicants to Mythal would have first paid obeisance here. It is where they paid fealty to the gods, said Salas. Only the reverent were permitted to touch this ground, and only in solemn contemplation. Perform a ritual to appease elven gods? Long dead or no, I don't like it. There's no need for you to walk it, Cassandra. I touched her lightly on the arm. Better than anyone, I knew the foreboding that went with being forced into the service of a foreign god. The scar on her cheek twitched in a half-formed smile. She nodded, fingers flexing around the hilt of her sword, at peace with a job her maker could not reproach. I hesitated on the stairs to see if Salas might join me, if only to participate in something he'd witnessed in the Fade, but it appeared I was alone on my path. I'd stepped on one of the tiles in clearing out the ivy, but returning in worship had made it feel altogether new. I whispered a prayer to the All-Mother and took my first step. My life was hers already, there would be no sacrifice in bending to her will. If the anchor broke me, then I broke to the service of a god. If not Mythal, then to one of her children. As I finished my petition, the shrine cried out in a chorus of light and sound that brought sudden clarity, the orb didn't belong to Mythal. The sunlight and blue skies of her magic tasted nothing like the anchor's verdant forest. They were related in their own fashion, but distinct, ancient powers that spoke of gods who truly existed. Though I'd always believed that, in my day-to-day life the gods functioned as allegorical figures. I could draw on their stories for guidance and pray for wisdom, but they did not intervene in my life or speak to me in the Fade. They were gone, and gone felt as good as dead. Yet with Mythal's magic on my skin, I could not help but know that she was real. It left me with a sense of reverence I hadn't felt since the night my Valislan were completed, when 3 days of pain and meditation turned my focus so sharply inward that I hovered on the edge of the Fade in waking. To feel like that once more, only minutes after blood and death and dragons? It made the whole world seem sharp and fresh. Morrigan stood upright from where she'd been leaning against the banister. "Let us see what awaits," she said. We took the stairs, overgrown as they were, along a path littered with red Templar corpses pincushioned by arrows. The fletching was unusual, but then again so would be the clan that dared to make their home in the Arbor Wilds. Whoever they were, they had my respect. To live within these temple walls surrounded by live magic outstripped the grey ruins of my childhood. When the stairway divided, a dark blotch of red paint on the wall drew me left instead of right with the others. It was a sketch of elves within the belly of a beast, and coming close to examine it I noticed soft light through an archway down the corridor. Wait. I knew we did not have time to explore as we usually did, but something beckoned. I shouldered my staff and passed under the arch into a small, dark room. Through another open door I discovered a garden terrace as verdant as the emerald graves. Thick ivy crept up the stone walls, ferns swayed in the breeze, and tall grass sprouted from between the ancient cobblestones. A canopy of palms and sylvanwood put green above me, soft moss put it below, and between them both I found him lounging, Fenharil in repose. I stood transfixed, strung between dread and awe as Morrigan joined my side. "Why would this be here?" "Something wrong?" Cassandra asked, turning to the mage. "It depicts the dread wolf, Fenharil," she replied. "In elven tales, he tricks their gods into sealing themselves away in the beyond for all time. Setting Fenharil in Mythal's greatest sanctum is as blasphemous as painting Andraste naked in the chantry. Some chantries display statues of Andraste's betrayer Mapharoth as part of the chant," said Cassandra. "It might fulfill a similar function," she conceded. "A reminder of vigilance for the faithful. For all your knowledge, Lady Morrigan, you cannot resist giving legend the weight of history. The wise do not mistake one for the other. Pray tell, what meaning does our elven expert sense lurking behind this?" "None we can discern by staring at it." I laughed. "Says the man who found Skyhold because he claims the world is full of wonders for those willing to look. Reveal to this humble Shemlin, Inquisitor, what keen observation you glean from the sight." I thought strongly at Cole, begging that he would not mention how quickly Morrigan always brought lightning to mind. "My clan set statues of the dread wolf outside our camp, but they're carved in fear. Ears back, teeth bared, hackles raised, posture upright. But there's nothing dreadful here, look. His ears are quirked and curious, mouth closed, hackles down, tail curled. What better facade for a being your people call the trickster? The fact remains that he does not belong within this hallowed place. You're missing my point. This was carved before the fall, I said. When he was still beloved. While she merely arched an eyebrow in consideration, the reality of it squeezed my heart to breaking. Our legends plainly state that he walked as one among the gods, yet I'd never imagined how convincing his illusion. I'd always pictured Fenharel as a bald-faced traitor, a wayward son the gods, in their mercy, were too soft-hearted to strike down. How much greater the betrayal to think the gods and the people once believed he loved them in return. How many of Mythal's worshippers entered this very room to whisper Arlath Ma, Fen. I couldn't even finish the thought. The magnitude of my blasphemy with Salas seemed truly obscene now that I stood within ruins wrought by the wolf himself. Chapter 55, Abelis. I found the temple beautiful and wild, magnificent colonnades of sculpted marble sprouting wheels of ruby fungus, intricate tilework split by twisted roots, vaulted ceilings caved to gravity so that sunlight and ivy streamed through. Everywhere we went, Mythal's statue was crowned by a bird nest and fleeced with cobwebs. In every room, Fenharel slept under a blanket of moss. Such staggering loss. To think. Salas trailed off, overwhelmed as we passed through the Hall of Shrines. Cassandra had compared it to the Grand Cathedral in Valroio, but no mundane Shemlin architecture could compare to what the Elvaean had wrought with magic. It was glorious, but in truth I did not quite share the sense of sorrow it brought to Salas. He could appreciate its former glory from his travels in the Fade, but I'd never known an elven temple that wasn't already in ruins. I grew up in such places, my clan wandering between the ruins that dotted the Meninator, so the birds and trees and dragonflies made the temple feel more Anathera than Skyhold. I'd once considered that a point of elven pride, a heritage that Flat Ears abandoned for their cities, but now I feared my wildness was merely Dalish. If I were thrown into Mythal's temple at the height of its grandeur, it would have been as foreign as Halam Shirel. I can hardly imagine this place apart from the forest. Not entirely apart. In the Fade I have seen such structures, woven in concert with nature and design. Like roses trained upon a trellis. It just sounds sterile. Roses should ramble. A figure of speech, Vihanan. I myself was raised rambling in the wilds, said Morrigan. Yet, I have found great satisfaction in the civilization denied me in childhood. Do you miss it, Lady Morrigan? Asked Salas, perhaps uncharacteristically cordial under threat of lightning. My childhood or the Korkari wilds? Suffice it to say that in either case I found my prospects much improved by the blight. I was glad enough for the conversation, because it was far better than considering Andruil gone mad, Fenharel rebelling against Mythal, or Phalandin bringing death enough to fill an ocean of blood. Better than thinking about Elvaean who lived like Orlshians, in sparkling palaces where nature was a thing to be tamed. It was none of it as I had expected, wrinkles in belief that would require much reflection to smooth. In time, we passed through a narrow passage where the bricks had tumbled down in piles, then through an enormous trefoil door to a massive undercroft. The checkerboard tiling on the floor was gorgeous, but not enchanted. There was no shrine or altar, but the statue of many archers and well-tended braziers to light our way. At this sign of life we shaped up our formation. Cole took point, lanky and languid in a place without 1,000 hurting hearts to rile him. I could hear the rattle of Cassandra's armor behind me, and the scrape of her boot as she turned a slow circle to guard our rear. Salas and Morrigan flanked me, together knitting a barrier around us all. I sensed nothing unusual but for the hum of magic that ran through the entire hall, but as we approached the end of the chamber I heard the soft stretch of bowstrings. Finethys. How? At least 4 archers, if I could trust my ears to sort out shifting sounds, but if they'd drawn in perfect unison it could be 4 sets of archers instead. Shit. Salas would have heard it too, and Cole would be aware of my own awareness, but for the sake of Cassandra and Morrigan, I stopped short to whisper, "We're being watched." Vinevis, came a gravely voice from the shadows, and for a split second I thought of Hawk's little wolf. Following the sound, I looked up to see a hooded figure glowering at me from the balcony. Elven, to be sure, though unusually tall and broad-shouldered. You are, unlike the others. You have the features of those who call themselves Elvaean. The anchor roared to life at his command, a feat only Corypheus and Salas had ever managed, and my pulse quickened to wonder which sort of mage he'd prove. The emerald light in my palm bounced up to dispel the shadows beneath his hood, revealing the Valislin of Mythil, deep and green like my own. The sight could not have been more welcome. You bear the mark of magic, which is familiar. How has this come to pass? What is your connection to those who first disturbed our slumber? There wasn't a mage in Thedas who'd call the mark familiar, the fact from which the rest tumbled into place. Not slumber, not Dalish, Othenera, Elvain. Oh! My heart leapt. Cadholish had not been their only refuge. Not all were lost to the fall. I was stunned into silence for a moment by the enormity of the revelation, 1,000 half-formed hopes racing through my mind in an instant. This changed everything. Our ancestors yet lived. With Elvain to guide us, the people would have a home, perhaps a nation in the Arbor wilds, far from human concern. The Eluvians could be restored, all of them. Briola could, suddenly so much more seemed at stake. He had to know we're on the same side. I lifted my voice to a near shout, lest it be lost in the distance between us. Mythilin asked, Harin. They are my enemies, as well as yours. He relaxed a degree and his hood fell back just enough to reveal the smooth dome of his head. His skin was ashen like my own, eyes flashing gold. He'd been alive for millennia but looked no older than Salas. Creators, everything we knew about Othenera was true. I am called Abelas. We are sentinels, tasked with standing against those who trespass on sacred ground. Without servants attending his slumber to brush honeyed tea upon his lips, Abelas could only have survived by drawing on the energy of the fate itself. I couldn't even begin to wrap my mind around what that said about his power. Our lore stated that only a rare few Elvain achieved this perfection, and that supplicants would come to seek their wisdom in dreams. That I was speaking to such a man was a wonder. But how long had he been apart from the world? Did you sleep in Othenera before Arlathan fell to Tevinter, or did you seek refuge here after the fall? The Shemlin did not destroy Arlathan, he said, turning the world upside down. We Elvain warred upon ourselves. By the time the doors to the sanctuary closed, our time was over. I know what you seek. Like all who have come before, you wish to drink from the Virabalasin. It is not for you. It is not for any of you. No, I promised, still reeling. I am here only to stop Corypheus. It is meaningless. He commands an army of blighted soldiers. We will endure. It was beyond comprehension that I would presume to argue with an Elvain, but fresh from Othenera he would have no concept of the risk. Corypheus was unprecedented. The breach was unprecedented. At a loss, I turned to Salas and dropped my voice low. Perhaps he'll listen to you. What shall I say, Inquisitor? Shall I sway him from a millennia of service by virtue of our shared blood? He had a fair point. Barefaced he could no more appeal to Abelas than he could waltz into a Dalish camp and borrow a hala. I had walked the petitioner's path in June's shrine and wore his sign, perhaps I could appeal to Abelas as Lethalin. Our people have lost everything. We need you. We could learn from you. But if Corypheus destroys this place, then all will be lost. Our people? The ones we see in the forest, shadows wearing Valislin. You are not my people. No. No, 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 no. I'd heard this speech before. I knew that tone. Our people? He'd said. Who are? Oh, you mean elves. Oh, gods. No. It might as well have been a magnet turning my head to look at Salas, because I did not want to see. But there he stood, too tall, too proud, altogether all too Salas in the truest sense of the word. None like him, except... I killed the thought. Salas was a powerful mage, but I'd seen him nearly outstripped by Venatori. I'd seen him dead in Red Cliff. If Emolath had a card that fucking big up his sleeve, he'd clean up after every battle the way he schooled Iron Bull in chess. He'd not have languished in prison for a year. Not that I had time to mull it over while Abelas continued to condemn me. You have invaded our sanctum as readily as the Shemlin. I threw my left hand into the air and let the anchor's magic flare unchecked. It was a bluff to be sure, but if Abelas found the mark familiar then perhaps he respected its source. The god I worship compels me to stop him. I know this place is sacred, and I've respected it as best I can. I believe you, he said, and I didn't know which of us was more surprised. If these others are enemies of yours, we will aid you in destroying them. When this is done, you shall be permitted to depart, and never return. Never. Our own ancestors would deny us, then. I caught my breath and consoled myself with the knowledge that opinions could be swayed. If I defeated Corypheus, if I fought with honor, if I proved myself worthy of Abeles, then perhaps he would one day reconsider. The Inquisition once intended to kill me, and yet I'd become their leader. If I could achieve even a fraction of that success for the people. Salas turned to me, his voice quiet and pleading. This is our goal, is it not? There is no reason to fight these sentinels. Morrigan took me by the arm. Consider carefully. You must stop Corypheus, yes, but you may also need the well for your own. Yes, lightning would be nice. How savage did they each presume the Dalish if Salas felt the need to stay my hand while Morrigan thought it could be so easily forced. Had I ever led us into a battle unprovoked, had I ever claimed a prize for myself? I turned my back on them to face Abeles. At least his judgment was born of duty. I accept your offer. You will be guided to those you seek. As for the Virabalasin, it shall not be despoiled, even if I must destroy it myself. In a heartbeat, Morrigan shrugged off her human form and flew as a raven to overtake him. But Abeles was quicker still, already disappearing through a door beyond our reach. My barrier snapped up reflexively, anticipating arrows that never came. It was a tremendous gesture of good faith that we were not killed for her treachery, or perhaps it was the respect they paid to whatever god's power burned in my hand. She turned into a bird, said Cole, breaking the silence. The archers disappeared into the shadows even as a hooded mage emerged to lead us deeper into the temple. It had been untouched by the passing centuries, but felt like a nightmare running through the gilded halls, not allowed to pause and wonder, not allowed to stop and pray, not allowed to study, not allowed to question, not allowed anything but glimpses, just glimpses, and safe passage en route to the end of the world. We found the foot of the Well of Sorrows beset by Red Templars, and throwing myself into battle was a relief. At last a problem I could understand, one that could be burned and choked and cut into manageable pieces. And when I finally reached Samson and saw him drenched in Elvean blood, I cast the rift and gave myself over to the fight. The dance was familiar, glyphs bright, staff spinning, and the tip of my blade brought to bear whenever he ventured too close. Focused by my rage, each spell seemed to land with more impact than the one before. I saw nothing else, my world reduced to this single point. And then Cassandra was shouting my name, her gauntlet on my shoulder to haul me back, the bulk of her armor between us. Samson was on his knees and nearly done. Why was she? Why would she? He's still breathing, Inquisitor. We can take him back for judgment, he can answer. She was insane. She'd called elven worship nonsense while the power of a god burned in my hand. I shrugged from her grasp with a mind blast to send her flying and called for Amalia before casting a static cage around us. I would not be stopped. Fuck Shemlin justice. Fuck never taking a prize for myself. If the Inquisition owed me anything at all, it was this man's head. Samson convulsed beneath the lightning that licked his armor, biting his own tongue as he seized from the voltage. I slammed the blade end of my staff through the gap at his pauldron with enough force that it slipped through the joints and into the ground below. I didn't care to pull it out, I didn't need a staff to be a danger. He was unable to breathe from screaming, choking on his own blood, frantic from the violet smoke of a nightmare pouring from his eyes. And pain, oh, gods, I knew there was pain. I threw my arms wide to summon an ancient rune that seared the air before me, and shuddered as the energy barrage ripped itself from my mana. With such a clear and simple goal, every last fireball found its mark and the lightning of my cage responded in kind. And when I screamed for the dread wolf to take him, it wasn't blasphemy but an earnest prayer. Samson had once been good. He'd been a friend to the mages in Kirkwall. He'd tried to stop Meredith when even Cullen had not. But all the goodness in the world didn't stop him from turning into the lapdog of a man who'd pretend to be God. He was a betrayer, and to the betrayer he belonged. In a moment more my spells were gone, and so was Samson. I stepped barefoot on his breastplate to dislodge my staff, and when I pulled it free Amalia fed me with his death. For once I was proud to be the Dalish savage everyone seemed to think I was, because I wanted nothing to do with the civility that would spare a monster. Cassandra had her shield up, wary and concerned, but Cole slipped blithely through the bodies, happy for 2 hurts at an end. Then I looked over my shoulder and saw Salas, long and lean and resting on his staff, simply watching, lust undisguised, the ghost of a smile on his lips. Chapter 56, Elvain such as I. Gods, I wanted that mouth. For a moment I held his gaze, nearly burned by the heat in their stormy blue, then the sound of booted feet pounding the grass broke the moment. I whipped around to find Abellas sprinting across the green, racing a raven. The Elvain hit the paving stones on the other side of the terrace and cut right so hard the angles of his body seemed nearly parallel to the ground as he tore down the length of a reflecting pool. Oh, gods! Morrigan would defile the Well of Sorrows. I jumped from Samson's corpse in pursuit, digging my toes into the grass to spring forward. Far ahead, enchanted stones threw themselves into a makeshift mountain that Abellas ascended with impossible speed, leaping and bounding like a hala. Creators, he was fast. I folded the veil as I'd done before, exploding through the fade to scramble up the stones behind him. He came skidding to a halt at the top just as Morrigan crashed down to tumble back up in her own skin. Abellas turned to look at me, then back to Morrigan, falling into a defensive posture. Morrigan stood between me and the well, wolf fangs jangling from her staff as she crossed her slender arms. You heard his parting words, Inquisitor. The elf seeks to destroy the Well of Sorrows. As his duty demands, I reminded, desperate for Abellas to know I would submit. But it won't to come to that. Corypheus needed Samson to use the well. Without him, there's no vessel to claim it. The moment we leave, he will send more forces to secure this place. Then we take the fight to him. A few hours ago we didn't even know the well existed. We leave it. And pray, how shall you forfend his rebirth? Corypheus will merely rise anew to continue the assault. Would that our resources were so limitless. He didn't reclaim the mages after Redcliffe or the Grey Wardens at Adamant. Corypheus will move on. That is his way. The well clearly offers power, Inquisitor. If that power can be turned against Corypheus, can you afford not to use it? Do you even know what you ask? Abellas cut in. As each servant of Mythil reached the end of their years, they would pass their knowledge on, through this. All that we were. All that we knew. It would be lost forever. It was a repository. Like an amulet of power for knowledge, once used and forever gone. I understood the urge to protect such things, I'd always been loath to break a charm. But there was nothing in Thetas that held power not meant for release, magic was not meant to lie stagnant but to flow, through lyrium, through our mana, through our staves, and back to the Fade. I make no claim on the well, Harin, but if I am a shadow as you say, then who will claim it? Everything your people were is already gone. It is, he conceded. Better it be lost than bestowed upon the undeserving. My heart wrenched. I'd been raised the heir of Lavalan, first to a keeper in a line unbroken since the long walk. My only purpose was to preserve and protect the people, to seek out our history and restore what was lost. Even as Inquisitor, I had no other goal. Yet standing before the only judge who could possibly matter, I proved unworthy. Whatever came of Corypheus, my failure was complete. There are other places, friend. Other duties. Your people yet linger. The soft-spoken sincerity in his voice came as the sweetest surprise. Salas, who ever and always struggled to reconcile himself to the elves, had at last joined our cause, daring Abellas to see us as his descendants, lingering and in need. There would be a place for him at Skyhold, whether we partook of the well or not. Abellas shifted from foot to foot, pacing back to regard Salas with curiosity. Elvain such as you. It wasn't a question, but an accusation, and the nagging fear I'd so quickly smothered came screaming back to the fore. Salas regarded him coolly for just a moment, then ever so slightly inclined his head. Yes, he said, drawing out the word. Such as I. I forgot to breathe. Creators. Oh, gods. Salas. Of all the impossible things that might have come to mind, I could only think of the raw lust on his face when I'd killed Samson. That thought became my anchor, the one thing I could say about the man that I knew beyond a shadow of a doubt. Everything else? Everything else was unraveling. I joined the Inquisition to save the world, he'd said, regardless of whom my people are. When we fought after Halam Shirel, I'd mocked his stories as second-hand memories of another man's life, and he wept. I thought he'd been hiding a sordid past behind the tales of Arlathan, but he'd lived there. All those memories had been his. I have watched dynasties fall and empires crumble, he'd said, and I'd only rolled my eyes. I thought he was being melodramatic. I thought he was deflecting, unwilling to trust me with his past. Creators. Oh, my gods, he'd been locked in Othenera for millennia with Thetas unfolding before him in dreams. Perfection. That was the term my keeper taught me, a state achieved only by those who could feed from the fate itself, perfection. I'd been a water lily, skimming along the surface and oblivious to the depths below. I'd been asking the wrong questions all along. In a daze, I saw Cole fixated on the man called Sorrow, and Cassandra staring at Morrigan. The witch looked only at the well, while Salas and Abelas remained locked eye to eye. That's when I noticed that neither had blinked. In my shock, I'd unwittingly slipped into a bubble of focus. Oh, June, give me focus. Let me bend unbreaking to the knowledge that threatened to overwhelm me. Let me hold that tension like a bow. The bubble burst, time snapped back into place, and I swayed a moment against the speed of the world. All that mattered was protecting the well from Corypheus. You have shown respect to Mythil, and there is a righteous in you I cannot deny, said Abelas, still fixed on Salas. Then he spun to me. Is that your desire? To partake of the Virabalasan as best you can, to fight your enemy. Not without your permission. One does not obtain permission. One obtains the right. The distinction spoke to a power dynamic that I couldn't quite understand, but no matter. This was more than I'd ever hoped. The Virabalasan may be too much for a mortal to comprehend. Brave it if you must, but know you this, you shall be bound forever to the will of Mythil. Bound, said Morrigan. To a goddess who no longer exists, if she ever did. Bound, as we are bound. The choice is yours. Is it possible for Mythil to return? I had to ask, had to know. Anything is possible. Elven legend states that Mythil was tricked by Fenharil and banished to the beyond, said Morrigan. Elven legend is wrong. The Dread Wolf had nothing to do with her murder. Murder? I said nothing. She was slain, Abelas went on, if a god truly can be. Betrayed by those who destroyed this temple. I was taken aback, but unmoved. Already the bards sang that I came close enough to saving the Empress that the assassin's blade had pierced me too. That much was even true, but only because I fell against it so the blade would draw a wider path. I'd killed her as surely as Florian, but only 5 people would ever know. In 1,000 years, no one would suspect me, and I would not mock the wolf in thinking him less clever. If not Fenharil, then who? Ask your god, Shemlin. Having brought my own bluff and misbegotten heritage back to haunt me, Abelas abandoned the well. There is a place for you, Lethalin, Salas called out. If you seek it. Malus Amalin Eni Halam, Abelas. While Salas clarified his invitation to skyhold for Cassandra, I escaped to Morrigan's side. I was afraid that once I looked him in the eye, Salas would know that I knew, and I couldn't help but fear what would happen. I wanted to believe it changed nothing, but that seemed so naive. Not that it mattered now. We had to unlock the well, and the Eluvian in turn. Tentatively, Morrigan and I reached out to test it with our mana. However still its waters, some force churned within. It seemed to have a gravity of its own, powerful, all-consuming. I wanted nothing more than to feel it cool against my skin. I wanted to strip and bathe, to drink until I choked, to swim until I drowned. With a tremendous force of will I tore my thoughts away and staggered back. Creators. I did not expect the well to feel so hungry. Morrigan turned and smiled slyly. Let's not be reckless. We are mortal, after all. Of those present, I alone have the training to make use of this. Let me drink, Inquisitor. You alone. I nearly laughed at her audacity. I have studied the oldest lore. I have delved into mysteries of which you could only dream. Can you honestly tell me there is anyone better suited? Shall I make a list? You lead the Inquisition. This is not a risk you can take. I am willing to pay the price the well demands, and I will use its knowledge in your service. Or more likely, to your own ends. Salas jumped in with unconcealed malice. What would you know of my ends, elf? You are a glutton drooling at the sight of a feast. He threw an accusatory finger in her face. You cannot be trusted. Morrigan narrowed her eyes and turned to me. So then you would drink, Inquisitor. I didn't say that. Him, she laughed. Because he is your beloved? Oh, you are a fool. I stilled 1,000 angry retorts, because they would only give Salas away. Abelas knew the well and its power better than anyone, and cautioned a mortal would not fare well. Though it shook me to the core to think it, he had a point. I was Shemlin, a quick child who would die too soon. Sooner still if I did not survive Corypheus. The wells in Ansel belonged to the people, and Salas alone could preserve that knowledge for millennia. Oh, gods! Millennia! I bottled up the flood of realization that threatened to pour from that word. Salas! No, he snapped. Do not ask me again. Surely he knew that I knew. The subtext might be lost on the humans, but he could not expect a Dalish to let such a word slip by. Mahilani. If Morrigan is right and it overwhelms me, how will we stop Corypheus? She is right about one thing alone, we should take the power which lies in the well. A weight settled on my shoulders as he said the words. I thought of all the stories Varric told, of Anders bound to justice, slowly giving in to madness until justice was a wish gone wrong. So many voices, Cole whispered. They would be in your head. Talking over you. You don't want them. Ma Nuvanen, I said to Salas anyway, because whatever my fear I could not let a Shemel, a human, drink from the well. I wanted to say goodbye, not knowing if I would still be me when it was over, but Salas had turned cool and distant. While the others clustered together near the edge of the well, Salas retreated to the ivy-covered wall without a word. He wasn't looking at me, but through me, almost battle-ready in his tension. And then I was grateful for the well and my fear, because I'd rather drown there. I stepped into the water, and its energy rolled up from the depths to greet me, washing my fears away. It wanted me, called to me like Amalia, promising that I'd never be alone. It felt as if I were floating somewhere far away, in the midst of a vast ocean with no shore. Its power was immense, would only be a thimble of the sum. I stood waist deep in it, not even lyrium felt like this. Oh, this was something else entirely. Peace settled over me. How had I ever been afraid? Inquisitor. There was only the well. Tendrils of magic arced up to caress my skin, and in the smooth waters I saw my own reflection. June didn't matter, I was beautiful and beloved by Mythil. The All-Mother would guide me through whatever was to come. I would bring her justice, and she would bring mine. Vihanan. Something far away bothered me, a buzz that only grew louder to spoil my worship. Perhaps there was some threat? I lifted my gaze from the water to see a man at the edge of the well. So very, very far away. He seemed unhappy, somehow. Ma Lath, come back. Please. Come back to me. Of course, I would come back. I only had to drink, or drown, and either would be my privilege. Of course I would come back. Of course. But not yet. Not now. First, Mythil. She would always be first. I couldn't see the anchor beneath the water, and my left hand was as it had always been. I could be as I had always been, serving the people, not the Inquisition, not an unknown god, but Mythil. Vihanan, look at me. Look. Do not drink from the well. Inquisitor, listen to him, came a far less alluring voice. His fear is plain. It cannot be safe. Let me take the risk and I will be your sword. I will find the answers you seek. Come. I cupped my palms and scooped up the sacred water, my mouth had gone dry. I would drink, and drink, and drink until the awful thirst was quenched. Arlath Ma, Vihanan. I am begging you. Rial. The voice broke with grief and at last caught my attention, so that I finally saw him. Salas. Not so far away as I thought. A ward might as well have prevented him from touching the water, but he stood as close as he could, one hand outstretched, fingers splayed and desperate, reaching for me as if I were about to slip away. Was I going somewhere? When our eyes met, his panic became a lifeline, my only connection to anything apart from the well. By sheer force of will I found the strength to move one foot ahead of the other while the whispering voices begged me to stay. And when I was at last close enough for him to reach me, hot hands on my skin were stronger than the well. He hauled me from the water so fiercely that we both fell back to land in a tangle of limbs. Salas was panting with fear, clutching my head so tightly against his chest that my world reduced to a single sound. The beating of a heart. My heart within him. Vihanan. Chapter 57, Elisanilla Visan, Visanel. Somewhere behind us, Morrigan had entered the Well of Sorrows. Salas pulled me up just in time for us to both be knocked back down by the tidal wave of magic and water that exploded out from its depths. I coughed, hands on knees, spitting water, but it was just water, it no longer sang her song. Salas looped his arm around my waist to help me up once more, and I leaned into him harder than strictly necessary. He was so real, I couldn't forget the sound of his voice, pulling me from the depths. Together we turned to see the well completely drained and one bedraggled human supine in its center. Morrigan. I lurched forward, but Salas held me fast and bowed his head to my ear. She will be delirious, he whispered, close enough that I could feel the shape of every word. Be wary of whatever she says. I didn't need reminding with the dreamy compulsion of the well still vivid against my skin. We rushed to Morrigan's side a moment after Cassandra and Cole reached her. She twitched and moaned in confusion, her head lolling and limp, and I knelt to clasp her neck, afraid she might choke. The moment my fingertips met her skin, her eyes flew open and she'd scrambled to her feet, mumbling and touching her face as if it were not her own. Perhaps it wasn't. She looked around in wonder, and I didn't know if I were jealous or relieved. Elisanilla. Visan, Visanel. I glanced at Salas but he only shook his head and frowned. Morrigan staggered back, turned a slow circle, and looked around, then she jammed her eyes shut, blinking to drive away whatever clouded her vision. I am intact. There is much to sift through, but now we can. A sickly, charcoal mist began to rise up at our feet and I looked up to see Corypheus wreathed in smoke, flying as if he were in the fade. All at once I remembered his touch on my wrist, his breath hot on my face, pain lancing from my shoulder, and his magic invading the anchor. He'd found us at last. The Eluvian. Morrigan shouted. My world was set aflame with lyrium blue and I crashed backwards into Salas, magic brighter than the anchor seeping from every pore. I wheeled around to see the same electric energy alive in the Eluvian. Somehow, I had become the key. There was no time to think, only to run, and whether by an instinct born of my clan or the Inquisition, I knew I would have to go last. Cassandra was loath to do it, and Cole nearly so himself, but both followed after Morrigan and Salas disappeared. In the seconds before I jumped through, I saw the figure of a woman in the water, rising up against Corypheus. I lingered, enthralled. My gods, was that Mythal? I desperately wanted to stay for what would happen next, but if I were the key then the others would be trapped in the crossroads. To my horror, when I pushed through the mirror, I tumbled home to Skyhold. We all stood stock still, blinking, confused, and then the magnitude of the transition hit me. My panic was matched only by my sense of helplessness. Cullen, Gaspard, and Briola would think us dead or, worse still, would die if Corypheus opened a rift. Our forces could not hold out against an infinite supply of demons if I were not there to seal it. Should Gaspard believe that I had perished, would he consider his oath invalid and lose Briola in the wilds? Before anyone even had a chance to move, I grabbed Salas by the arm. Find out what's happening. Vihanan, I. Sleep. Dream. Find your friends, battle attracts the spirits, they'll know. I need to know what's happening in the wilds. Cole, can you help him? Cassandra, get Dorian. I didn't even drink and the well nearly overtook me. Morrigan will need another mage to ground her. With that I took off, there was time for nothing else. When I burst into the great hall, Varric knocked over a tankard of ale in surprise, then gave chase as I took the stairs to the rookery 2 at a time. Talk. I don't know. We just jumped through a goddamned Eluvian. Fuck. Varric helped me scribble duplicate notes to our forces. At Skyhold. All safe. My command, your decision, Cullen to hold our ground, Gaspard to advance, Briola to retreat. It would have to be enough, every second might matter. Without knowing how Corypheus responded to our departure, I had no confidence to dictate their action. If Haven had proved anything at all, it was that Cullen knew how to make a stand. If need be, he could embed our troops and wait for my arrival. Yet if Corypheus fled, I would not deny Gaspard an opportunity to grind down the Red Templars if he wanted to give chase. But if escape were needed, neither could match Briola's network of Elovians. I could do nothing but throw Leliana's ravens into the air and fret. We shouldn't have gone through the Elovian. Salas warned me that Morrigan would be incoherent. He warned me. Part of me wanted to ride hard for the wilds, part of me feared Corypheus would lay siege against us at Skyhold. Were my troops being slaughtered while I wavered in indecision? Were Gaspard's? I peered over the railing to see Cole sitting on the floor, braced against the couch where Salas had stretched out to enter the Fade. That he'd chosen to lie down worried me, it indicated a longer trip than I anticipated. For a few hours in the Fade, sitting in meditation would be comfortable enough, but this? Cole tipped his pale face up, his eyes masked by the strands of blonde. When I turned back to Varric, Cole was crouched on the table between us, twisting a quill between his fingers. Once, it captured wind for wings to fly fast, flowing, floating, now it captures faded fires for words that fly instead. I rubbed his shoulder, hoping the words would fly fast enough. Never a fan of Cole's more spirit-why moments, as he called them, Varric cleared his throat in frustration. Kman, Boots. Let's get you something to eat, or clean you up, or something. I let Varric talk me down to the tavern, if only because Cole loved nothing more than to eavesdrop on dinner, snatching up all the little memories every smell and taste could conjure. We brought Josephine along so that I could bring her up to speed as well, but nearly everyone else, Iron Bull, Blackwell, Vivian, Leliana, and Syrah, remained in the wilds. After that, I rode out to the encampment around Skyhold to put our remaining forces on alert. I knew I owed the tale to Keeper Haan too, but I didn't have the strength. Skyhold felt strangely empty by the time I returned to the rotunda, and I found Salas still dreaming the Fade. He hadn't even stripped off his armor, truly taking my plea for hurry to heart. He'd be sore and miserable when he woke, so I knelt down to unfasten his leather vambraces, then curled my fingers along the back of each thigh, each calf to get at the lacing of his greaves. When I'd stacked the blood-splattered armor against the wall, I undid the buckles of the wide Khmer belt that covered most of his torso and parted the long robe he wore to gently slide the belt out from under him. I maneuvered to sit on the edge of the couch and carefully unclasped the dragon bone bever around his neck, then set it on his desk. I returned to sit beside him, forcing myself to believe it was a good sign that he had not yet returned. If he had discovered something dire, he would have surely awoken by now. Yet it worried me to see lines of tension along his forehead, that little scar bunching against his furrowed brow. Bit by bit, I trickled a restorative into this mouth, wondering with morbid curiosity who must have attended his early, centuries in Othen era. It was hard not to look at him anew, hard not to wonder how I came to capture an Elvaean heart. My time with you is precious, he'd said, and now I understood. Presuming I didn't get him killed first, my light would burn out as quickly as a sunset while he'd live on for ages beyond counting. It was no wonder he was afraid of dying alone, it was inevitable. I kissed the little scar and smoothed his forehead with my thumb. I said I'd forgive him anything, but this wasn't something to forgive, it wasn't even something I could comprehend. There was an uncomfortable negative space in my mind as I realized the scope of what I did not know, and how quickly the rest had been shaken. A single day had proved a razor, cutting through the fabric of my belief. The temple left what I knew of Arlathan in tatters and frayed my grasp of the gods. Abelas cut the ties I thought bound me to Elvaeanan, pulling apart the very seams of what it meant to be Dalish, to be Elven, until I was no more than a Shemlin shadow. But in the tangled mess of my unraveling world, Salas was not a thread doubt could pull from my grasp. Chapter 58, The Angles of Her Face. The sun at our back bled pale pink and gold across the snow, and the mountain air burned my cheeks. We hadn't even paused for our armor and staves, which seemed a little reckless, but my curiosity was piqued. Salas was not one for clandestine excursions, so when he'd said come with me, Vihanan, I simply followed him to the stable and that was that. We rode in comfortable silence for an hour, until the snow gave way to the grassy hills of Crestwood Valley, where he turned south toward Cair Bronac. I'd come to think of it as the stodgiest fort in all of Ferelden, heavy and squat and brown. In short, the last place in Thedas that I would have expected my Elvaean lover to bring me for a confession. I twisted to look up at Salas, but he only tightened his arms around me as he burrowed his nose behind my ear. The briefest of intermissions. Even without my Dalish armor, the scouts recognized me at a distance. None but the Inquisitor rode a wild heart. I could see them scrambling at our approach, so when the requisitions officer came running out to greet us, I waved her off to explain that I had not come on official business. We paused long enough to relinquish Sharton into the stable master's care, and to swipe a few vials of Elfruit to undo the ache of travel. Salas took me by the hand as we ventured in the general direction of Glenmorgan on foot. We'd long since cleared the area of bandits and Templars, but it felt unnatural to be out in the open and unarmed. Then again, maybe that was the point. How often had we wandered the woods surrounding Haven with nothing but our bows? Even unchanneled, we could together wield magic more lethal than any arrow. I miss hunting with you, Salas. We shall hunt again. My bow was lost in the avalanche that buried Haven. Then let us hunt under no power but our own. I rubbed my thumb along his index finger, pleased that however many millennia there were between us our thoughts could be so alike. We continued along the muddy path, all but washed out from Crestwood's endless rain. In the fading light of the setting sun, the hillside seemed aglow. A little higher up the beauty turned ominous with the realization that it was only red lyrium. "What will you do?" he asked, "with the power of the anchor once Corypheus is dead?" "We can't go back to the way things were," I said, thinking of the Templars that kept every clan on the move. "I'll try to help this world move forward." "You would risk everything you have in hope that the future is better? What if it isn't? What if you wake up to find the future you shaped is worse than it was?" I leaned against him for a pace, realizing that he had shared my heartache all along. While the memory of a dark future ate me from the inside out, Salas knew in truth what it felt like to wake and see the world gone wrong. He lived in Elvaean, and when all the elves of Thedas were noble and magic came as easily as breathing, and there was no amulet that could take him back. "I'll take a breath, see where things went wrong, and try again." Just like that. It's been just like that since Red Cliff, but I'm not arrogant enough to think it's my decision alone. Whatever happens, we'll do it together. You think to share your power, to avoid the temptation to misuse it. A noble sentiment, he said. But, ultimately, a mistake. Why? Because while one selfless woman may walk away from the lure of power's corruption, no group has ever done so. I trust my friends. His voice turned unexpectedly sharp. I know that mistake well enough to carve the angles of her face from memory. Her. It was the closest he'd ever come to speaking directly of anyone from his past. Whoever she was, she'd left her mark. The bitterness in his voice was like nothing I'd heard in him before. "You have not been what I expected, Inquisitor. You have impressed me. You must not let false modesty allow you to pass your power on to someone else. There are few regrets sharper than watching fools squander what you sacrificed to achieve. You're being grim and fatalistic in hope of getting me into bed, aren't you?" I teased, not in a mood to be the Inquisitor. "I am grim and fatalistic. Getting you into bed is just an enjoyable side benefit." He pulled me closer as we walked beneath the moss-covered wings of Phelan Dinsguide and through a narrow passage crowded with red lyrium. When it opened back up, we stood face to face with Fenharil, impassive but no less imposing for being carved of stone. I shuddered to think what once inspired the Elvaean to flank a path with death and betrayal. "Forgive my melancholy," said Salas, ducking into the entrance of a cave. "Corypheus has cost us much. The Temple of Mythil did not deserve such a fate. The orb he carries, and its stolen power, that, at least, we may recover. Whatever comes, I will have you by my side." And so he was, even as we walked through a dark and winding cave lit by the fluorescent glow of deep mushroom. Salas moved with the same sort of languid confidence he'd shown that night at the Veilfire Torch, but everything he once said now burned differently in my mind. "Faith is hard won, Lethalin, worth of pride." He hadn't been talking about Mother Giselle at all. Like Abella's, he'd once considered me a shadow, but that night I became his kin. Somehow, without even knowing it, I'd won him over. Deeper into the cavern, I recognized the spot where Dorian once dug up a bottle of Sip-Sip. Oh. I knew this place. Though I recalled little of that day aside from wyvern venom and gore, I discovered the grotto otherworldly at dusk, lush with greenery as dark as my Valislan. The air hummed with magic as alive on my skin as the fine spray mist that rolled out from the waterfall. Towering hearts stood guard over the shallow pond, and I was secretly pleased to see Ghilan Nain's creatures loom larger than both Phelandin and Fenharel. Hearts were associated with magic in Clan Lavalan, a good omen that sparked a smile. Ghilan Nain alone among the gods had ever been mortal, a mage granted Apotheosis by Andruil by some accounts, her lover. I raised an eyebrow at Salas, trying not to overthink the symbolism. The veil is thin here, he explained. Can you feel it on your skin, tingling? I reached for him with my mana, finally understanding why he woke with such a sudden urge to take us from Skyhold before I could even begin to question him about the Arbor Wilds. Quiet conversations could be had anywhere, but dreaming in Sthinaran could carry a soul into the deepest reaches of the Fade. I was trying to determine some way to show you what you mean to me. I know what we mean to each other. Even so, he smiled. For now, the best gift I can offer is the truth. You are unique. In all of Thedas, I never expected to find someone who could draw my attention from the Fade. You have become important to me, more important than I could have imagined. Bit by bit he loosened the knot of insecurity that had lodged itself in me the day before. It seemed like such a small thing to reciprocate, when centuries added a weight to his words that mine could never match. Yet I knew it wasn't a contest. I loved him with all that I had and could only trust that it was enough. As you are to me. Then what I must tell you, the truth. Your face, he hesitated. The Valislan. They honor the elven gods, I said by rote, caught entirely off guard by the unwelcome turn in our conversation. No, his eyes darted along my Valislan and he frowned. They are slave markings, or at least, they were in the time of ancient Arlathan. Why would you say that? Because it's true. That's bullshit. It honors June, this is his symbol. You know that? Yes, that's right, he said. A noble would mark his slave to honor the god he worshipped. After Arlathan fell, the Dalish forgot. It drove the air from my lungs. A noble would mark his slave. There were slaves in Arlathan. It was supposed to be our home. How had that knowledge ever been forgotten? The idea floated away, abstract, unreal, and I tried to tame the defensiveness that came over me. So this is, what? Just one more thing the Dalish got wrong. I'm sorry. Slaves. My people lived in scattered clans so that no single disaster could ever take our heritage or freedom again. The sheer scale of our failure was incomprehensible. Our ancestors weren't lords and ladies, but something bought and sold. I thought of my brothers and sisters, my Lethalan, my clan, all of us branded like cattle, and I chalked back a sob. We try to preserve our culture, and this is what we keep. Relics of a time when we were no better than Tevinter. Don't say that. For all they got wrong, the Dalish did one thing right. They made you. I pulled out of his arms, wavering between embarrassment and shame. I'd never felt that before, shame of my body, but now I felt filthy. How many times had I stood naked before him, mistaking pity for lust when his eyes slid along the lines of my Valislan. I couldn't even look at him, knowing he only saw ignorance smeared across my face. I didn't tell you to hurt you, he said, gathering me back to him. If you like, I know a spell, I can remove the Valislan. Everything went cold. I touched my throat, and the power in my own blood cried out so that I could trace every line without looking. Valislan were the one exception, blood magic to bind a clan together. It was not a spell that could be undone, but a Sylvanwood prayer, my promise to June that I would bend but not break in his service. I was 14, Salas. I don't choose my Valislan for the ancient elves, I chose them for myself. Even if what you're saying is true, I don't think I can let you just erase them. I know, he coddled. I'm so sorry for causing you pain. It was selfish of me. I look at you, and I see what you truly are, and you deserve better than what those cruel marks represent. Selfish. I hesitated. There would be no going home if I did this, but at last I realized the truth, there would be no going home without him. We'd never spoken of a future together, the threat of Coryphaeus simply loomed too large, but it was nearly over. We might actually win. And when it was done, Salas would not abide to live among the Dalish, nor would I ever dream to confine him so. If we survived the coming battle, there was nothing I would not sacrifice to remain at his side. We could build a new life. When I found the courage to look up, I saw worry etched into every line of his face. Then cast your spell. Take away the Valislan. The ghost of a smile tugged at the corner of his mouth. He tipped his head toward a patch of grass near the water's edge. Sit. Hand in hand, we knelt together as if this would be a prayer of our own. Salas slowly lifted his hands, and cyan light like lyrium flared from his palms. I steeled myself for what would come. Receiving my Valislan brought the most extraordinary pain that I'd ever known, and I could not imagine the cost of their removal. My eyes fell shut, solid in hymenasal. Even through closed lids, the brilliant light was inescapable. His magic lit my Valislan, racing down my throat and breasts, across my hips and to my toes. I actually felt the blood dissolving, lifting itself from my skin, burning up, and dispelling like a flame in a cool breeze. It was swift, painless, clean. I was clean. His hands brushed past my ears as he wound his fingers into my hair, tilting my head back to regard me anew. Arlosa Malarivis. You are free. The cadence of his voice made it sound like part of a ritual, and I looked at him in wonder. We rose to our feet and I felt so suddenly shy, naked in a way I'd never been before. I was someone that I'd never been before, no longer lingering in the ruins but forging ahead to build something of my own. You are so beautiful, he said, and I believed him. Our foreheads bumped together, and he nuzzled close until we fit like puzzle pieces. We held there for an eternity, simply breathing, knowing, before at last he swept me into a kiss. As ever and always, the coolness of his tongue over mine stole my breath away. I rose up on my tiptoes to meet him, curling my fingers around the smooth skin at his crown. I smiled when he palmed my ass to draw me closer until there was no space between us. It was so comfortingly familiar and yet entirely new because I was new, because he'd made me new. I clung to him through a wave of desire like I'd never known, something deeper than longing, more than Lathma could ever say. Vihanan, I whispered. I am sorry, he apologized suddenly, pulling away. I distracted you from your duty. I laughed, uncertain of the joke in his oddly chosen words. Wait. What? It will never happen again. Salas, I caught him by the fleece of his tunic to soothe whatever fear had suddenly gripped him. Please, Vihanan. All right, I released him, still confused. Just tell me. Whatever you need, we can find together. No, we can't. You'll see. I'm sorry, he spoke only madness. Salas, don't. I'm not giving up on you. You truly should. His voice turned dark and dangerous, causing the night to swim around me. You have a rare and marvelous spirit. In another world. Why not this one? I could barely breathe, when had things gone sidewise. I can't, he said, and the finality in his voice might as well have been a smite. I'm sorry. Sorry? Sorry was a human word, a politeness I couldn't comprehend any more than the sight of him walking away. I was paralyzed to stop him, rooted to the ground in my shock. He'd actually left. After all the times he'd turned away, and all the times I'd called him back, he was now well and truly gone. Of all the fights we'd ever had, this hadn't been a fight at all. I'd failed some test without ever knowing the rules, a failure so complete it didn't merit explanation. The magnitude of it came crashing down like a physical blow and I fell knees and fists into the mud, short of breath. Herellen. It was me. It had always been me. I hadn't even asked for proof, or time to think, I didn't ask anything at all. Not even a candle mark before he'd told me trust was a mistake, but I didn't hear the warning, didn't think it meant us. Salas once said I was worthy of pride, but I'd finally proved him wrong, showing him how quickly I'd betray it all, my pride, my people, my heritage, my God. June. Oh, my God, June. In a panic, I tore open my tunic, pawing down my breastband and bending my neck to see. Nothing. There was nothing. I peeled off my breeches, twisting my leg to find only bare skin at my calf where it should have been green, bare skin at my hip where the branch once divided, emptiness where the leaves once sheltered my heart. No, not my heart. Vihanan was gone. Splashing into the water, I flailed for a rock, scrubbing as if it were only covered up and I might call the blood back where it belonged. Oh, God, June. I'd given up my own blood, my childhood wish, my rite of passage, all of Lavalan and every other clan. Whatever the Dalish got wrong, they were still my people. My breath felt like liquid, drowning me in my own skin. I'd gambled with my birthright and lost. There would be no home for me when this was done, the Dalish wouldn't have me, Salas wouldn't have me, and I'd been a fool to think the Inquisition had ever done more than upgrade my cell. They weren't my family, they weren't my clan, they only wanted a body to throw at the hole in the sky. Whatever came, banal and Azalin. I crammed my fist against my mouth. I couldn't fix it, couldn't kill it, couldn't cut it into pieces small enough to understand. There was no spell to bring it back, no words to make him stay, no going back, and forward would be alone. Wake up, wake up, wake up, wake up, wake up, wake up, wake up. The pressure in my chest mounted, and I staggered to the shore. Stupid, quick-blooded child. How had you ever thought an Elvayan would have you? With hearts towering above, how had you ever forgotten the moral of the story? Gillan Nain was led into the woods by the honeyed words of a hunter, blinded, bound, and left for dead. But no god would come to save me and Andruil had gone mad. Chapter 59, Sthanaran. Skyhold. A fire roared in the hearth, but with the balcony doors flung open the air was biting and cold, it seemed I never could remember that doors were for closing. I slid from the silk sheets of my Orlshion bed, felt the soft pile of the ruby rug beneath my feet. I looked down at my thighs, ashen and bare. Truly bare. Oh. So this was me. Now. Wherever I went, bare like a child or a flat ear, and I didn't know which was worse. I took the stairs, padding down marble to the second flight of rough wood below. A raven cried from somewhere within the tower as I threw open the door. Little gasps and hushed whispers filled the great hall, followed by dead silence as hands covered mouths and courtiers bowed in confusion, humans scrambling and stumbling back to burn with second-hand shame let them, I'd burned mine dry. I finally stood free from every false thing, no costumes, no pretending, no gods, no game, no history, no people, no future, no heart because mine was gone, and the one I'd been given gone cold. I didn't what the future held, I could only be certain of the now, tiny moments I could be sure of. And, for now, I was sure I wanted a fight. I stormed through the crowd, watching them scatter from my path, to the place where Varric stood by the hearth, eyes averted and beardless cheeks flushed red. When I shoved open the door to the rotunda, I found him painting the dark, lean lines of Abella's, but disfigured and broken, one leg instead of two. Salas glanced over his shoulder with casual disinterest, his brush never pausing as he flicked the charcoal gray into the point of a sword. Inquisitor. Since you didn't have a chance to inspect the extent of your handiwork, Harin. I rested one hand on my naked hip and let myself be a thing for him to look at. For them all to look at, because I could feel the eyes above, Dorian and Fiona and Leliana and the awful tranquil, but to the void with them. I would not hide from this. I'd been small, and quiet, and hidden far too long. How many times have you cast that spell? I screamed. How many of us have you erased? Arlath ma Belinaris, why did you do this to me? I did nothing, he said, returning to Sorrow's stark silhouette. The credit is yours. I'd let myself get so caught up in the fantasy of it that I hadn't sensed the desire demon at my back until warm breasts pushed against it, and a slender hand slipped around my throat. Your Valislin are not lost, Delenn, she purred, scraping a talon along lines I knew by heart. I can call them back. My fingers moved to beckon lightning, and I waited a breath to let the power build. Your blood would sing for me, she said, trailing lower. You would sing for me? I brought down enough lightning to consume us both, channeling it through my body to hers. But when I jumped and wheeled around to face her, The lithe figure only rose up on tiptoes, buoyed by my magic, electricity racing across its violet skin and horns thrown back to scream in ecstasy. Salas stepped between us with a regal bow, one hand outstretched. "Come, before the band stops playing, dance with me." If it had worn any other skin, I would not have hesitated. I'd faced my share of demons in the Fade, I'd faced the nightmare itself, but, oh gods, that face. That pale spray of freckles and that shy smile. "You're not him." "Maybe I am," said another Salas. Suddenly I'd been shoved across the desk, face down in a book that swam with fucked up runes in a language I'd never known. There was a hot hand on my neck that felt like his, but it wasn't. I closed my eyes and reached, but the thread I'd always followed seemed tangled and lost. I didn't wake up. "Get out, demon. Do you think I am the Iron Bull, playing little games and pretending at power? Do you think there is any word in Thedas that could stop me, flat ear?" The memory of a hand slid across my mouth, and the memory of a cock brushed between my thighs. With a roar, I called a mind blast to halt the flood of memories before they were poisoned in full, twisting onto my back beneath him. Then a rush of air brushed past and I felt a hot splash of blood on my face. Salas slumped down onto my chest with an arrow through his eye. A slow trail of blood escaped the corner of his mouth, and the light in one gray-blue eye went out. The fletching scraped my cheek as he slid to the floor, and I called fire before leaping from the desk to discover another Salas behind me, brightly polished bow in hand. "Put aside your superstition, Delenn. You're not a Dalish anymore." The flame in my palm sputtered and died, even as a rift split the air above me. I had no time to think before a fourth Salas grabbed my hand to close it. We stood side by side while a torrent of magic exploded from my palm, the strength in the demon's grip as it held my hand in place, both of us shaking from the backlash. Then it was done, and a perfect imitation of my sweet Haran that day turned toward me with a smile. "It seems you hold the key to our salvation," he said. Then his skin flushed red, lyrium sickness tainting his features until his eyes were aglow. What if there was another way? What if there still is? In a blur of blue motion I tripped through the Fade, sheltered against the wall by yet another Salas. The air was abuzz, and I felt him, truly. My Salas. But in the next instant, he flew tumbling across the room beneath an enormous black shadow, streamers of ruby light and blood oozing into the air. "Salas!" I screamed, throwing up a barrier to protect him. The magic thundering down was extraordinary, and for a second my barrier held up against the shadow, giving Salas time to catch my eye. "I'll miss fucking that slave mouth," he said with a feral grin. The shock of it broke my barrier and the shadow tore out his throat, then went bounding across the room like a wolf. No, not a wolf. The wolf. It left a trail of blood-slicked prints across the stone, destroying one Salas after another, the archer, the Haran, the prisoner, the painter, all of them eaten up by betrayal. The Dalish subconscious is not a subtle thing, and the Fade gave me a wolf most dreadful, horror and chaos and cruelty incarnate, a monster devouring every Salas I'd ever known, every Salas I hadn't, leaving nothing but broken bodies and blood in his wake. Yet my Salas was somewhere in the dream, his magic was so palpable, and oh, gods, if the demon were to kill him here. "Salas, wake up." So many demons called out in his lilting voice, fragments of memories stolen and twisted, bodies pouring in from every door, leaning over the railing to shout, but only one of them was real, and I couldn't find him. And while I failed, Fenharel tore them each apart so I could watch each Salas die over, and over, and over, and over, and over again, each body as broken and red as Red Cliff. At last I saw him atop the scaffolding, by the blue column of Celine's gown, above the fray, where of course my Salas would always be. I shouldered through the others, tearing myself free from familiar hands that grabbed to keep us apart. I reached the ladder and surged halfway up before another Salas wrapped his arms around me to drag me back down. I tightened my fingers around the rung, desperate not to lose hold, but when he bit the bare, blank skin of my thigh I lost my grip and fell. He grabbed me roughly by the ear and turned me up to face him. "I didn't always free my whores when I was through," he said. "But you were unique. In all of Thedas." He went flying across the room, the back of him bloody and ragged and slashed, and the wolf stood between us. I didn't stop, didn't think, just threw fire and watched in helpless horror as the flames slid over the wolf's coat to engulf the Salas on the other side. His skin went black and blistery, peeling back to the bone, and I screamed, reaching desperately for my body outside the fade. When I didn't wake up, I lunged for the ladder, then there were strong hands hauling me up to safety. Salas pulled me away from the edge and against the wall, brushing blood off my cheek with his thumb. "You can never go home, Herr Ellen," he said. "Not Salas. But with my power, you need never be alone. Say you are mine." I froze. Atop the scaffolding there was only one of him, but below there were hundreds and the wolf. In a single swipe, Van Harel toppled the scaffolding and we fell in a tumble of paints and shattered splinters. A giant paw sent me sliding across the bloody floor and I hit the wall just where the Sword of Mercy was painted. I looked up in time to see Salas hanging limply from the wolf's mouth, blood dripping from its teeth. It shook him like a ragdoll and slung him to the ground. The weight of its 6 eyes fell on me as I staggered to my feet. Oh, dear gods! I woke up screaming, strange arms around me, holding me down in the real world. I called lightning, scrambling back for my staff and finding nothing but dry bones. That would have to do, and my fingers closed around what could only have been a cunary femur. There were 2 Shemlin and a dwarf bearing down, effortlessly dodging my poorly focused spells. I called for Amalia, but she'd abandoned me too. I needed more space, then time. I darted back and rolled for cover, came up sheathed in lightning, anchor blazing. The closest Shem had already danced from my static cage, and the other circled behind me, ghosting far too close for comfort. "She doesn't see us," he said, his reedy voice close enough that I was able to land a bolt. "No shit, kid," came a rough voice in the shadows, and I pulled a rift in the veil somewhere near the sound. "Fuck. Fuck yourself," I spat. The larger Shemlin, a mage, drew closer and I realized I was completely naked. I knew this scenario, every elf knew this scenario, but he'd never have the fucking chance. I didn't need a staff to call fire, it was a keeper's first spell. Ar2 Enaden. "Rial, my love, look at me," said the Shem, gritting his teeth as fire rolled over his barrier. His accent was familiar, though, and I knew that face, somehow. "Do you see me? Rial? It's me, Dorian, Lethalin." The anchor sputtered in my palm, and the lingering trace of the fade fell away. The man dropped his staff to hold up both hands, a smile forced upon his lips, but dashing nonetheless. "Dorian." I swayed and he was on me in an instant, arms circling and scooping me off my feet. "This is my first proper swooning with a lady, I do hope I'm getting it right." "Dorian." "Cole," I hit Cole. There, love. I've got you." "You're alright, Cole's alright." "I'm alright." "See? Cole's alright. I've got you." "Varric." I twisted, trying to find him. He emerged from the base of a statue, Bianca at his back, never drawn. "Easy, Boots. You'll have to try a lot harder than that if you're sick of my stories." I blinked. The sun was bright but not above us, nearly evening. Crestwood. I was in Crestwood. I'd slipped into the fade where the veil was thin, hadn't set any wards. How long had I been lost in a nightmare? I thrashed, trying to find my feet, to stand, to run, and Dorian let me go. I stumbled back, still in a panic, splashing into the pond and falling into cold arms and colder hands as Cole kept me from sliding under. The water burned my skin, which had been completely abrade, gouged along the lines I'd lost. I jammed my eyes shut, reeling. "How long, what? You're asking me? All I know is that Chuckles came slinking back to Skyhold without you this morning, and the kid was in a panic. So I grabbed your favorite Shemlin and we hit the road." "What an Andrastes." Varric was looking at my face, brows furrowed. He knew the Dalish. He knew what I'd done. Everything from the night before came rushing back, and oh, gods, it was so much worse. I turned away from them and retched, but I had nothing to give. Everything was all already gone. Cole's hands were on my back, gentle where there the skin was whole. Baron, blank, she thought clean slates meant new beginnings, but it was the end. Then I was dimly aware of being pulled from the water, the weight of something warm around my shoulders, and the smell of Varric's leather duster as I was brought to shore. Dorian sat beside me in the marshy grass, heedless of the mud. One hand hovered over mine for a moment, then closed around it tightly. He wasn't much of a healer, but he lent enough mana to set the worst of the scrapes and scratches closing. "Real," Dorian said very slowly. "Did Salas do this to you?" I swallowed, knowing my response would someday be in Varric's book. They would be the words that told the Dalish what I'd done, as surely as his words once informed the extent of Meryl's crime. He'd painted his Daisy as kindly as he could, but at the end of the chapter she still held the knife. But for all that I hated her, for abandoning her clan, for dealing with demons, for consigning herself to an alienage, for killing her keeper, what I hated most about Meryl was that she always found a way to shift the blame. My mouth went dry. "No," I told him. "I did this to myself." Chapter 60, 3 Trout Farm. I woke from another nightmare unafraid of the weight on my chest, unafraid of the shadow blocking the moon, unafraid of a razor edge catching its light. How could I fear a silhouette against the night sky with a halo made of stars around his head? "You're so much louder," he marveled. "I'm sorry, I'm so sorry. Hiding won't heal the hurt." "I know." Fingers feathered across my forehead as he wound my hair around his fist. A sharp pull and the glint of silverite told me that it had been done, and once again I fell in awe of a little spirit who always knew just where to slip the knife. He seemed to fade away then reappear, stretched out in the grass beside me. He smelled mossy and clean, like he'd bathed in the Minander, like he'd slept in the woods, like my little brother. I curled up against his back, fingers tight around his arm, at last unafraid of falling back into the fade. Check the description for the links to the author.